This episode is a trackpads.com production.
After the opening days at Cambrai, the British stood in possession of something that looked, at first glance, like success taking shape. The line had been driven forward, villages had fallen, and the old certainty of trench stalemate had been shaken in a way few soldiers on the Western Front had ever seen. Yet the new British position also had a dangerous form. Instead of a clean, broad advance that settled into a comfortable new front, it had become a salient, a bulging projection of ground thrust into the German line. Impressive to look at on a map, and much harder to live inside on the battlefield. That is why this stage of Cambrai matters so much. It shows how a battlefield gain can be real and still become dangerously unstable once its shape is measured in roads, ridges, and exposed flanks rather than in hopeful arrows on an operations chart. This podcast is accompanied by a companion book that expands the story of the Battle of Cambrai, with additional historical context, maps, and dozens of enhanced colorized photographs from the battle. Your purchase helps support our mission to keep these podcasts free. You can find the book at militaryauthor.me or at trackpads.com. A salient sounds like a technical staff term, but the idea is easy enough to grasp. Imagine pushing your fist into a sheet of cloth while the rest of the cloth stays mostly in place. Your fist is the salient. It has gone forward farther than the ground on either side, which means it may threaten the enemy in front of it, but it also means the enemy can look at it, fire at it, and eventually strike at it from more than one direction. That is the central danger. A salient is attractive because it seems to promise the next step of an offensive. Yet it is also vulnerable because it creates shoulders, flanks, and a neck through which supplies, reinforcements, and orders must pass if the bulge is to survive. Cambrai turned that military truth into a lived reality. The British did not set out to create a dangerous bulge for its own sake. The salient emerged because the battle's success was uneven. On the 20th of November, British forces surged ahead in places like Havrincourt, Ribécourt, Marcoing, and the approaches toward Bourlon, while elsewhere the check at Flesquières and the canal problems near Masnieres meant the line did not move forward with the same speed or depth. The result was not failure, it was distortion. Some sectors drove deep, others lagged, and the whole front began to bend into a shape that looked powerful from above but already contained hidden weakness. Once later efforts east of the canal lost momentum and the struggle shifted north and west toward Bourlon Ridge, that shape became even sharper. The British were no longer simply holding captured ground. They were holding a protrusion. On the map, the position was undeniably tempting. The British salient threatened the German defensive systems in front of Cambrai and seemed to point toward the roads, railways, and rear communications that made the local German front function. A thrust in that direction suggested pressure not only on the enemy's first trenches, but on the whole arrangement of his line between the canal and the scarp system farther north. That is why the gains made so much noise back in Britain. They looked like the beginning of something larger, as if the British had found the gap through which a local success might be widened into a wider unhinging of the front. A salient can inspire exactly that kind of hope. Its forward point seems to promise that the enemy is nearly off balance, that one more push might turn pressure into flight, and that the attacker is now the master of the next move. In reality, the northern shoulder of the new position was already warning that the picture was not so simple. Bourlon Ridge and the wood upon it dominated the ground north of the advance, and as long as the Germans retained any meaningful hold there, the British position below remained exposed. Observation mattered enormously in this war. An enemy on the ridge could watch movement on roads and tracks, direct artillery more accurately, and keep pressure on any force trying to organize in the lower ground around Auneau, Graincourt, and the southern approaches to the wood. This made the salient dangerous in a very practical sense. It was not merely that the British had gone forward. It was that they had gone forward under the gaze of enemy-held height. A bulge overlooked by hostile guns is not just vulnerable in theory. It is expensive every hour it is held. The southern and eastern side of the salient was scarcely better. The failure to force a strong passage across the Saint-Quentin Canal at Masnieres and the inability to sustain a convincing push through the crossings around Marcoing and beyond meant that the right side of the British advance remained thinner and more awkward than the first-day map suggested. Infantry could get over in places, local gains could be made, and some villages could be seized. But there was no broad, secure artery through which cavalry, guns, fresh battalions, and supplies could move in the mass needed for a real exploitation. That meant the salient's eastern promise was greater than its eastern strength. To hold such a position safely, the British needed either a firm crossing system and a wider flank, or a much shorter, tidier front. For several days, they had neither. Then came the problem of feeding the bulge. A salient is not held by courage alone. It must be supplied, relieved, wired, mapped, defended, and kept connected to the army behind it. At Cambrai, the British were trying to do this through roads and approaches already broken by movement, shell fire, and congestion. Tanks had helped create the advance, but many were now gone from useful action. Artillery needed to come forward, yet guns and ammunition moved slowly on crowded routes. Infantry battalions that had made the initial gains were exhausted and often had to keep holding positions before proper relief could be arranged. The deeper the bulge projected, the more pressure fell on the limited tracks and junctions that served it. This is one of the least glamorous but most decisive truths in warfare. The map may show a forward line. The battle is often decided behind that line, in whether the roads to it still function. This is why the British decision to keep fighting for Bourlon Ridge mattered so much. Once it became clear that a strong push across the canal was no longer realistic, the commanders faced an ugly choice. They could stop where they were and accept a position north of Flesquières that was still dominated by the ridge. Or they could attack again in hopes of securing the high ground and making the salient more defensible. Neither option was good. Stopping early risked leaving the new gains exposed at excessive cost. Attacking again risked deepening the salient and pouring more tired troops into increasingly difficult ground. They chose to continue, because without the ridge, the whole northern side of the advance looked dangerously unfinished. That decision was militarily understandable, but it also meant the bulge would become deeper before it became safer, and the battle would pay dearly for that gamble. By the 28th of November, the British had reached positions on the crest around Bourlon and were ordered to lay wire and dig in. That sounds, at first hearing, like consolidation. In practice, it was the sign that the offensive had hardened into a defensive problem. Digging in on a salient means admitting that the ground won cannot simply be used as a springboard without first surviving where it now stands. And survival in such a position was hard. Much of the ground south of the wood remained under hostile observation. The shoulders of the bulge were sensitive to local counterattacks. Artillery could be concentrated against exposed troops in and around the ridge positions. Every relief, every movement of rations, every effort to bring up ammunition or clear wounded took place under the knowledge that the enemy no longer needed to guess where the British had ended up. He could see the shape of the bulge, and he could begin thinking about how to cut it back. The Germans understood the opportunity quickly, because a salient offers the defender a different kind of chance from the one the attacker first sees. To the attacker, it looks like a springboard. To the defender, it looks like a target with edges. The Germans did not need to erase the whole British advance at once. They needed to strike at the sides and supporting structure of the salient, to roll up parts of it, disrupt its communications, and make the troops at its forward point increasingly difficult to support. By the end of November, that thinking had matured into a deliberate counterstroke. One major attack was prepared from the south across the canal zone, while another would press from the Bourlon side of the battlefield. The intention was not merely to punish the British. It was to use the shape of their own success against them, hitting the bulge from more than one direction and forcing it to contract. That helps explain why the salient was so deceptive. Its danger did not lie only in the front line itself. It lay in the gap between what the British position threatened and what it could actually sustain. On paper, the salient looked like the opening of a great success. It pointed toward German rear communications, touched commanding ground, and seemed to prove that the trench deadlock had at last been broken in a meaningful way. In reality, the bulge depended on tired infantry, weakened tank support, congested approaches, incomplete control of key high ground, and a battlefield whose right flank had never been opened as cleanly as the first day had led many to hope. That is the difference between breakthrough and secure exploitation. One is an event, the other is a condition. At Cambrai, the British had achieved the first and were still struggling to build the second. In the longer history of armored warfare, this is one of Cambrai's most valuable lessons. A successful armored or combined arms blow can create a position that looks decisive and still remains dangerously provisional. The tank, the barrage, and the infantry assault can open the line, but they do not automatically solve the questions that come next. Can the shoulders be secured? Can the artillery move up? Can the supply roads hold? Can the commanding ground be taken? And can the enemy be prevented from striking the exposed sides of the gain? At Cambrai, those questions came very quickly and very hard. The answer was not that the breakthrough had been false. It was that a breakthrough without a defensible battlefield shape can become a burden almost as soon as it becomes a triumph. The salient was the physical form of that burden. You've been listening to famous tank battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.